Hello everybody, my name is Jeremy Bentham and it is a pleasure for me to talk with you at this energy conference. Now I've had the privilege of over 40 years experience in the energy industry, and with the last 25 looking at the future landscape, potential developments in that and decisions that affect it. And I say privilege advisedly because energy is so central to all our lives. You can't operate, build or move anything without it. And looking ahead, we're going to need more services from energy in the world, given both global population growth and more people rightfully seeking a material quality of life that is currently only available to the minority of people, like many of us. But we also all recognize that how we use energy is going to have to transform significantly and urgently if we're actually going to have better lives with a healthy planet. Otherwise, many of us won't have better lives at all because of environmental degradation and the stresses that arise from that. So, in this talk, I'm going to focus now on energy system transformation. I'm actually going to propose that there are ways of seeing this differently to the way most of us see it at the moment. You know, how we see the world really matters. Most of us see energy transition as a single, slow-moving, costly and supply-led hard slog. A burden. But if you actually consider past evidence, it can also be seen as a series of potentially fast, opportunity-rich, modest cost and demand-led tipping points of uncertain timing. And looking at it that way can unlock smart business, smart policy and smart politics. It can actually help us accelerate developments that we desperately need. So please come along with me as I unpack these thoughts a little, and I hope this will help you see things differently. As a minimum, we need to decarbonize energy use to arrest the buildup of greenhouse gases that are already driving climate turbulence. Most of us already recognize the 5 main blocks of technical developments necessary for this. So number 1, demand growth moderation through structural efficiencies like well-integrated public transport, integrated public utilities. Number 2, renewable sources of primary energy like solar and wind. Number 3, deep electrification of the economy to fully utilize the potential of solar and wind energy as they largely produce electricity. Number 4, substitution of fossil-based liquids and gases in those hard-to-electrify activities. Substitution with biofuels and hydrogen derivatives. And finally, number 5, we're going to need carbon removals to mop up and compensate for remaining emissions. Removals through natural processes like reforestation and soil regeneration, and through technical processes like carbon dioxide capture and storage. So these 5 technical blocks actually demand re-engineering of the bulk of the global economy. And that is, let's face it, a daunting task, and one which we're currently not doing that well with. How we approach this, where we direct our efforts, and ultimately our success all depend on how we see the nature of the system and its transformation. And this is a psychological matter as much as a technical one. As the recently deceased Nobel Prize-winning behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman has pointed out, we generally behave as though what we see is all there is. And many of our perspectives are conditioned by decades of public dialogue and the received wisdom that is evolved from this. Now, there can be a problem with this. The problem, of course, is that public dialogue often mixes multiple issues together so that the emerging received wisdom may not always actually be wise. And I believe this is the case with crucial aspects of energy transition, and that it is a key inhibitor to the pace of transformation. In reperceiving energy transitions, there are three important perspectives I believe need to be addressed. Perspective number one. The critical uncertainty is not faster or slower transitions, but sooner or later. Most future outlooks interpret change as evolving from the present at either a slower or a faster pace, e.g. the deeper electrification of the economy or the adoption of sustainable aviation fuels. And this is at least partially due to models and illustrations that aggregate data and show averages. Averages, for example, from different countries or from different economic sectors at different phases of change. But it's also the result of a template for steady change that is deeply rooted in our psyches. However, if you stand back and look at the realities, many changes that are significant happen fast and are often disruptive. You only have to look at what is happening currently with the global sales of battery electric passenger vehicles, or the deployment of solar power, or further back to the shale revolution in the noughties, or the growth of the LNG industry in the 1970s, or even back a century to the introduction of the car itself. And because global systems are so large, this explosive pace of growth can last for decades before it begins to be moderated by saturation effects. This explosive growth is largely driven by competitive dynamics. Once the stars align and an early mover demonstrates even the slightest prospect of success, fear of being left behind motivates others to jump in as well. This happens not only in business, but also in the accompanying arena of government policy. For example, the policy-driven success of Chinese solar panel manufacturing has spurred things like the European Green Deal and the US IRA policies, which seek similar domestic industrial success. The stars aligning, the pioneer businesses, early customers, supportive policy, supply chain partners create a tipping point. And so the critical uncertainty is not how fast will a development take off, it's almost always fast. But it is when will such takeoffs occur? Looking from today's perspective, will the stars align sooner or later? And this actually changes the core strategic question that needs to be addressed. It changes from, should I gear up to move quickly or slowly, to, given that the precise timing of disruptive takeoff can never be predicted, is it wiser to err on the side of potentially moving too soon or potentially moving too late? And very often, moving early to build competitive strongholds will be the wiser option, especially if you accompany that with efforts to align the stars as quickly as possible and prepare fertile ground for the subsequent takeoff that you're already prepared for. That was the first change in perspective. The second is that the transition is not high cost, but actually high opportunity with modest cost. Many articles that you've probably read emphasize the trillions of dollars of investments that will be required in the coming years to accomplish energy system transformation. Now, actually, only some of these articles are willing to bring the focus specifically on the additional investment over and above business as usual expectations. Even fewer, however, place this in the context of total investments in the entire economy, to recognize the relatively modest scale of energy transition investments. Fewer articles still emphasize that the costs for one party are usually revenues for another, so that the overall drag on the macroeconomy is actually very modest. With this broader landscape in view, the macroeconomic impact proves to be just a few percentage points in the projected size of the entire economy looking out decades from now. It's equivalent to just maybe a couple of years of economic growth at most, and is very small compared to the impact of, for instance, politically driven trade frictions or misplaced austerity measures or dislocations in monetary policy or fiscal policy. And it also doesn't take into account the positive macroeconomic stimulus to be expected from new technological possibilities and new types of employment with associated educational spin-offs. And similarly, it doesn't take into account the potential avoided costs from averting the worst impacts of climate turbulence. Indeed, the modest nature of even direct costs becomes quite apparent once you translate them into their impact on the final costs of what people actually consume. While the added cost to manufacturers of making green steel or green textiles may be 50% or 100% or more, the cost impact on consumers may be as little as just 2%. Just say $1 or €1 on a pair of jeans. In fact, the explosive growth highlighted previously, along with the modest additional cost that premium markets can readily absorb, this presents exciting opportunities for companies and countries who are forerunners in attractive transition areas. As an example, Tesla ignited the global market for battery electric passenger cars and now has a market value 10 times that of traditional giants like General Motors and Ford. Now, of course, sustaining value growth alongside and then beyond demand growth requires developing advantages that cannot easily be competed away. But early movers also have early opportunities to secure sweet spots. So in summary, the overall cost to society of making these investments will be relatively low or even entirely offset, and they can also bring great prosperity to some and good jobs to many. Now the challenge is that the benefits and costs are not usually evenly distributed, and so considerable effort is required to align the stars in a way that is both commercially effective and morally fair. Alignment mechanisms are needed to motivate, reward, or compensate sectors of the economy and society where investments and costs are concentrated. Now this is the real challenge, not the magnitude of the so-called costs themselves. And now I come to the third perspective. Number 3, the demand-led perspective is more powerful than the supply-led point of view. You see, our ability to see the bigger picture is understandably but unfortunately limited. Because greenhouse gas emissions derive from fossil fuel combustion, attention is often limited to enterprises that produce and sell fossil fuels or enterprises that use a lot of them. We rarely reflect on why there is a demand for these fuels. We don't connect the dots leading back to our own demands. And yet, of course, as individuals, we are enmeshed in a system of goods and services that build on considerable embedded energy or on material content largely derived from fossil fuels. The bulk of everything we do and use depends on them. Think of your furniture or your clothes, your food, your electronics, your house, the road you drive down, so on. Everything needs energy, and so in the words of the economics profession, demand is very inelastic in the short term. Now what this means is that when there are supply disruptions, as happened with natural gas due to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, rationing of shortfalls occurs through soaring energy prices. And these feed into increased prices for everything in the economy. They cause cost of living crises. And of course, these are felt most acutely by the poorest in society. So the narrow and simplistic supply-led perspective on energy transition implies for many ratcheting back fossil fuel supply. However, this is actually just a recipe for hurting the vulnerable and further misdirecting attention from where it needs to be. You see, instead, we need to aggressively and persistently reduce the demand for fossil fuels by changing the end-use technologies which currently need it. We can, for example, use vehicles with electric motors rather than internal combustion engines, make steel, concrete, synthetics and fertilizers in different ways. We can adapt aircraft and ships to use sustainable fuels. But even these activities are often only intermediates in the business chains that intersect with our everyday lives. Now, fortunately, just 8 of these business chains account for over 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. Fashion, food, electronics, personal care and similar fast-moving consumer goods, automotives, professional services, and additional freight outside those business chains. In addition, as mentioned just beforehand, sustainably produced versions of these goods would only add a few percent to the overall cost for the end consumer. The challenge is that the substantial investments required to reduce emissions are generally far upstream in the supply chains that eventually deliver those final goods and services to consumers. So mechanisms are needed that draw sufficient revenue from consumer-facing activities to the upstream heavy industrial operations behind the scenes where investment is required. Now, this could be kick-started, for example, by premium markets in goods like fashion, electronics, automotives and food, and by rigorous regulatory standards for their emissions footprints. The battery electric vehicle success driven by Tesla has already been highlighted, but that began with a premium market for a computer on wheels, with crucial initial support from Californian regulations on low emissions vehicles. Similarly, high brand value companies like Coke and Lego have rewarded the chemicals company Braskem for producing sustainable bioplastics. So, I believe that sustainable transition needs to become demand-led, and viewing business chains from the final end-use demand perspective could be the powerful lens that drives change. Taking these three perspectives now and pulling it all together. In summary, to accelerate change, there are some things we must see differently from how most of us see them currently. Now, this reperceiving is not easy. As the great economist John Maynard Keynes wrote, the difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from old ones. Yet, we might start getting somewhere if we reperceive energy system transformations as a series of potentially fast, opportunity-rich, modest cost and demand-led tipping points of uncertain timing, rather than just seeing energy transition as a single, slow-moving, costly and supply-led hard slog. So, 1. I urge you to explore that perspective. 2. I encourage you to move onto the front foot in anticipating the potential for explosive takeoff in new developments. And 3, I urge you to start focusing more of your commercial or regulatory attention on the sweet spot business chains that link downstream, high brand value, revenue generating markets with high emissions upstream activities which require large investments to decarbonize. Now, that would indeed be smart business, smart policy, and smart politics. So, thank you for your attention, and please enjoy the rest of this conference. And if you would like to explore more of these ideas, please also consider joining me in the online Dodo Club. Goodbye.